Hi, good morning. Thank you for making it here on a Friday morning and on such a beautiful day. This is a very important talk today. So, Jesse Sage is the former Associate Director of the American Anti-Slavery Group. You've read his profile, I sent it out. So I wanted this introduction to be more on the personal level. Because until 5 years ago, I wasn't aware of this, of what you're going to hear about today. And it was through Jesse that I learned about what is going on around the world and that slavery did not end in 1865. Recognizing this, realizing this through Jesse changed the trajectory of my career, the trajectory of my life. I'm indebted to Jesse for this, and I'm honored to have him here as a guest lecturer today. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Tal. Yeah. Good morning. That's quite an introduction. I have to say that when Tal called me up, he said, I'm teaching a class on leadership at Harvard, and I want you to come and give a guest lecture on an example of failure of leadership. And I thought maybe he was talking about me. So I'm glad to hear from the introduction that he intended maybe not exactly what I initially thought. I'm going to offer a couple of things. I will talk about a failure of leadership because that's how I sort of, despite myself, became, I guess, what you would look at as a leader, although I have never thought of myself as a leader. So I guess my lecture will be the lessons of a reluctant leader. In other words, what have I learned in my efforts to address a problem, and that in doing so forced me to take on some kind of leadership position. And I'll give you some background so you understand what I went through and what's sort of formed the lessons that I'll finish with at the end. And if we have some time, I'm happy to stay for questions as well. As I said, I was very involved in things as an undergraduate here at Harvard, but very rarely on a leadership level. So, for instance, I was really excited to do movie and album reviews, so I comped the Indy freshman year, and I loved the idea of getting free advance passes to movies. Like Pulp Fiction came out during the first semester of my freshman year. I was very excited to get an advance pass to go see that or to get free albums in the mail to review. And I enjoyed writing arts reviews, and the only way that I sort of began to assume a leadership position at the Independent was when someone asked me if I'd be interested in being an editor. And it was like, oh, yeah, I guess so. But it was never that I'd set out to be an editor or be involved. And I think that's an example for almost everything that I was involved in as an undergraduate. I enjoyed activities, but I didn't aspire to leadership. I aspired to enjoy myself as an undergraduate. I do have to say, I remember reading a profile in the sports section of the Indy, I think it was my freshman or sophomore year, of the then captain of the squash team, who was named Tal Shahar. And it was a fascinating preview of him, and it talked about his very outspoken thoughts on psychology and other intellectual issues. And I remember there was one point where he said that he turned in a paper proving the existence of free will. And actually his teacher had argued with him that this was an issue in a debate that had gone on for many centuries, and that there was no way that it could be simply proved and resolved. And I remember Tal saying, I didn't even need 10 pages to prove that free will exists. So that was my first sort of introduction to Tal Shahar, and I'm glad that a mutual friend introduced us. And I'm surprised to hear what an impact I had on Tal. That article still sticks with me reading that. My first point to you is that I think sometimes leaders arise to tackle problems, and I think in my case, if leadership came about, it was because I saw a failure in leadership. And I didn't see myself as a leader, but I felt obliged to crack a lock. And the lock that I saw was a lack of action or attention to the problem of modern-day slavery. And before I go into talking a little bit about modern-day slavery, I actually want to apologize to you. And the reason I want to apologize is that abolitionist activists in the 19th century in the United States, when they would give presentations, this was in the time before the Civil War, when slavery was still legal in many parts of the United States, they would begin their talks by apologizing. And the reason was that as their audience sat there in comfort, they were talking about an issue and a reality of people being owned like animals, beaten, forced to work for no pay, kept in the most dehumanizing circumstances. And unfortunately, I need to come to you this morning and share with you, it won't be the focus of my presentation, but I do need to talk with you about exactly this situation, but it's happening today, now in the 21st century, as you sit here in comfort as undergraduates at one of the most esteemed universities in the country and in the world, and I have to sort of interrupt your morning with this news, and I apologize for having to do that. But I also think that it's important that you hear this message, and I'm glad to be here because I hope that the message I'm going to bring for you today, both about the problem of slavery and also my experience trying to address it, is something that you'll take and do something with. So that's why I'm here, but I apologize for having to share this information with you. Like Tal, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't know about this issue. So I graduated in 1998, and I want to take you back for a minute to 1998, which is around the world, there are an estimated between 15 and 30 million people, depending on how people count, in slavery today. Today. And it was the same true as in 1998. And I don't mean people who have bad jobs or mean bosses. I mean people who are forced to work for no pay under the threat of violence. And this is a phenomenon that you see around the world. It's a global problem. The president of China is now visiting the U.S. China has a massive system of forced labor camps. You have a huge example of debt bondage slavery in India. And even in the United States, when I began working at the American Anti-Slavery Group, one of the first calls that I took was from a woman in a suburb just north of Boston who said, there's some people who appear to be held as slaves in the apartment across the hall from me. What should I do? And I can't say at that time that I had a good answer for her, but I discovered that there are cases of slavery even here in the United States. So although we've won the moral argument against slavery, no country will stand up today at the UN and say, we're pro-slavery, it's part of our culture and our heritage and our way of life, and you can't interfere the way that the states in the American South did. That doesn't happen today. We've won the moral argument, but the practical struggle against stopping people from being held like animals and forced to work for no pay has not ended. And Tal asked me to focus my presentation today on Sudan and the failure of leadership on Sudan, which I think may speak to some of you because of the issue Sudan is on campus today. But you should know that slavery is a global phenomenon, and if people have questions afterwards, I'm happy to talk with you about the many other contexts in which you find slavery. Needless to say, when I was an undergraduate, I don't think there was any course that addressed the issue of modern-day slavery at all. A massive human rights problem, no courses. I think Professor Tuck had a moral reasoning class on slavery, and like the last lecture, he sort of at the end, as people were getting ready for finals or going away on vacation, I think he sort of like passed out a few readings on contemporary slavery, just so you knew that this debate still had some relevance today. And I think that was it. So you could go through a Harvard undergraduate education and never learn about this. I certainly didn't learn about it in high school either. The enormous change that we see now, if you just look out between 1998 and today in 2006, is that there's an anti-slavery club at Harvard. There's a working group at the IOP that just put out a task report. This is run by undergraduate students on how to address contemporary human trafficking in the United States. I know that last year, one of the biggest international issues on campus was the genocide in Sudan. I know there was a big debate over a senior gift campaign I imagine many of you heard about. This was all unimaginable back in 1998. So for you to experience relate to the failure in leadership that I encountered, it was that you had this massive problem and no one was talking about it. In the case of Sudan, what you saw was a particularly brutal revival of a sort of old form of slavery. You had, in the context of the civil war in Sudan, militias from the north, armed by the government, attacking villages in the south. The villages in the south were Christian, they were animist, practicing traditional African religions, and in the Nuba Mountain region of the south, they were actually black Muslims, and they were being attacked by the government forces, and men would be shot, the villages would be burned, and the raiders were able to take war booty, and the war booty was cows and grains and women and children. This was going on while I was an undergraduate. I was sitting in classes, attending lectures in Sanders Theater and other places, and these slave raids were happening almost every day, with thousands of people being killed, thousands of people abducted into slavery, and we didn't hear about it. One of the people I work with, whose name is Francis Bach, has now written a book called Escape from Slavery. He's actually spoken on campus several times. Some of you may have heard him speak. I want to just briefly share with you his story so you understand the human side of what I'm talking about, because it may just sound like a general, sociological problem, but I want you to appreciate the human element of the problem that was going unaddressed, which is in 1986, when Francis was 7 years old. This was during the Reagan administration. These militia forces, armed by the government, swooped in on his village, or in a village right near him where he was visiting, and started shooting everybody. He was 7 years old. He didn't know what was going on, and he tried to run away, and suddenly there was a man on horseback in front of him pointing a gun at him, and he grabbed him and put him in the basket on the side of a donkey with a bunch of other kids, and he was marched north. Just like that, his life changed in an instant. He was taken by one of the raiders, brought to the man's house where the children and the man's wife came out, and they began to chant a song calling him slave, slave, black slave, and they beat him with sticks. He's 7 years old. This is his welcome to a new life. And for the next 10 years, every day, he was held as a slave. Every morning, members of the family would get up and beat him. He was forced to sleep outside with the goats and the cattle. He was fed the extra table scraps that were left over. His job was to look after the cows and the goats. And of course, if one managed to get away or escape, he was beaten severely by his master. And of course, this whole time he was not paid. And I remember the first time that I met Francis, we actually came and we took a walk here through Harvard Yard, and I showed him Widener Library, which he found totally fascinating. And we sat on a bench, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, the worst part is that for 10 years, I had nobody to laugh with." And for me, I'd actually been involved in the anti-slavery movement for a little while. I'd never thought about the psychological and emotional component of slavery, but I want to share that story with you so you understand just how serious this problem is. For 10 years, Francis had nobody to laugh with, and I should add that nobody here in the United States was really mobilizing in any major way on his behalf. Because I entered Harvard in 1994, Francis was still in slavery. In fact, for half of my undergraduate education, he was living as a slave in Sudan, and I had no idea. And he managed to escape after 10 years, and I don't want to tell you too much about his story, which you can read about in his book, Escape from Slavery, which I highly recommend. But suffice it to say, he's gone on to testify to the Senate, meet the president, speak on stage with Jane's Addiction at the Coachella Music Festival, and be honored by the Boston Celtics at halftime. So a whole bunch of, he's really become an outspoken speaker and leader of the anti-slavery movement. But when I was an undergraduate, or for most of it, he was either held in slavery or living in a refugee camp in Cairo. So this was the problem that we faced in 1998. There was no knowledge of this. And in fact, the big debate in 1998, if you wanted to talk about Sudan, was whether slavery even existed there. And the challenge about the existence of slavery and ethnic cleansing and genocide in Sudan was actually led by Louis Farrakhan, who's the leader of the Nation of Islam, who had actually gone to Khartoum, met with the leadership of the Sudanese government, and actually accepted some money from them. And suddenly, there were these reports coming out about slavery in Sudan, and he said it's not true. In fact, at the National Press Club, he gave a big speech saying, you know, if you think there's slavery, you go and find out. And so Dateline NBC went and documented slavery, but there was this challenge about, did it even exist? Was it even happening? Was this just a made-up story? So that was the environment that I came into in 1998 surrounding the issue. The second thing is that it did exist, and in fact, the major human rights groups had reports on it. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, several other groups. They were in the back of their files. There was no major campaign being led by these organizations. And in fact, in the mid-90s, representatives from the American Anti-Slavery Group, this was before I was a member of the organization, they actually went to Amnesty's national convention in Chicago. I think it was in 1994. And they introduced a resolution to add slavery to Amnesty's mandate. because Amnesty here was a big, powerful institution with important leaders. Why create a new group? Maybe Amnesty can take on this issue. And there was a debate, and Amnesty's national board voted to add it to their mandate, and they forwarded the resolution on, because Amnesty is a big bureaucracy, so they had to forward the resolution on to the international board in London, and the international board said, well, we need more time to study this issue. And for 10 years, it languished, not going anywhere. So the human rights community knew about this issue, but was doing no major campaigns on it. We can talk about some of the reasons why that was the case. You can certainly imagine at the time that if these slave raids were happening in France or in Norway, we would have all heard about it. Amnesty would have been leading massive demonstrations against it. There would have been major UN Security Council discussions about this, but it wasn't happening in France or Norway, and as a result, the world wasn't hearing about it. I should add, one reason the world wasn't hearing about it is that journalists weren't really reporting on the story. If you look back through the archives, there's an occasional story here or there, an example where a reporter covered it. There are just a handful. And I can tell you when Francis began speaking out, the first thing I did is I brought him to meet a reporter from the Boston Globe. And I'd introduced him to another escaped slave from a different country the year earlier. And we got together, and actually Francis writes about this in his book. We went out for breakfast. We had a very nice meeting, and the reporter ended up doing a story that ran, I think, on the front page of the Globe, a profile of Francis. And as we're walking out of the restaurant after breakfast, the reporter turns to me. This is a veteran reporter at the Boston Globe, and he says, you know, Jesse, I can only do these escaped slave stories once a year. So what I learned from that is that journalists and the media saw this as a freak story. This was not something that interested Americans or that Americans should care about on a regular basis, daily basis, weekly basis, even monthly basis. It was a freak story for once a year. And this is a decent, nice guy who's the reporter, and he was doing a nice thing about covering the story, but it showed me the institutional failures that we were up against. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that academics weren't talking about this issue. So you could go through Harvard and not have professors teaching courses on it, let alone holding lectures on it or giving talks about it outside of lecture time. So maybe for whatever reason you think modern-day slavery doesn't fit in your curriculum, your current curriculum that you're teaching. Certainly, with the many activist professors we had on campus, you would think someone would have given a talk or held a symposium about this. If there were one or two here or there. I never remember one from my undergraduate time. It completely passed by my radar screen. And so academics weren't dealing with it. So since Tala asked me to talk about a failure of leadership, and I should say one more failure, which was the U.S. government. So in 1998, Bill Clinton did send a missile attack on Sudan, you may remember, in response to the bombing of the U.S. embassies in East Africa. That was about it, and that was in response to terrorism against a U.S. target. It's also not clear whether the target that he hit was actually what they claimed it was, which was a chemical weapons plant. But that was basically it. So the State Department had human rights reports that, if you read them on Sudan, said that there was slavery and other, ethnic cleansing going on, massive abuses. But if you think this was a regular topic on briefings at the State Department or any talk by the president, no. In fact, through most of Bill Clinton's term, he never mentioned the word slavery in Sudan. And I will tell you the story in a minute of when he finally did that. And it was a breakthrough that came through hard struggle. So you have this massive failure of leadership, and the result is that as an undergraduate in 1998, we didn't know. The human rights community and human rights leadership wasn't really addressing the issue. Our professors weren't addressing the issue. Our diplomats and political leaders weren't talking about the issue, and journalists weren't covering the issue. So if I can ask for you to forgive me, I didn't know. And it was only by chance when a speaker from the American Anti-Slavery Group was on campus, and I was an American history and literature major, and I thought, I saw a sign for this talk, and I said, slavery? That sounds interesting, because I was interested in slavery in American history. So I went to the talk, and I discovered this whole world that I knew nothing about by a random small human rights activist speaking on campus. And I asked a lot of questions after the talk, and to make a long story short, the person said to me, what are you doing next year? And I said, I don't know. he said, you should come work for me, kind of like an offhand thing. And I said, okay, maybe I will. And I don't know how many of you are seniors, but I was approaching that stage where you have to figure out what comes next. And I knew I didn't want to do investment banking or consulting, which, at least in the late 90s, what seemed to be what most people were going to do. And I wasn't interested in graduate school. So I thought, I'll try this thing for 6 months or a year, be an interesting learning experience, and then I'll move on. And I didn't know even so much about the topic. And to make a long story short, I got sucked in for 8 years into this struggle. And I had no idea walking into it what was going to happen. The other thing I should tell you is that I really started out as a peon at the organization. So the first, I think, 3 or 4 months, I didn't even answer the phone. Which to me is very funny, because now we have interns come into our organization, and within the first day they're answering the phone after a little bit of training. But I didn't know anything about the topic, or almost nothing about the topic. I had to learn what it was like to be in a human rights organization. Any writing I would do had to be vetted by my boss and other people at the organization. It was a very sort of timid and humbling beginning, and I certainly didn't feel that I was up to very much. And I should say perhaps their concerns about starting slowly were well-founded. Just to share a story with you, the first time I did a radio interview, what happened was I was finally like, here was my big chance. Someone called the office from CBS Radio in LA, which is a major radio station. They wanted someone on for an interview at around 5 o'clock, I think 5:30 Friday time, and everybody else was leaving the office who could normally do the interview. So they said, Jesse, why don't you go ahead and take it? And I was very excited. This was my first chance to do a radio interview, and it was a big market. But it was late on a Friday after the end of a long week, and I was pretty tired. And for those of you who don't know, a lot of times when you hear someone interviewed on the radio, they're just sitting there on the phone talking into the headset. They could be sitting around in their boxers, and no one would know because they're just on the radio. It's the beauty of radio. Anyway, I'm in the office late by myself. I'm tired. The phone rings. It's the CBS radio host. He says, Jesse, thank you for being on the show. We'll have you on just a few minutes. And you sit there and you hear them doing the newscast, and so doing like the sports and the weather, and then there's like a little click when you hear that they've patched you in and you're now live on the radio. And I went through this fascinating thing where I was like, oh my God, whatever I say now, 1 million people are going to hear in Los Angeles as they're driving. And that kind of freaked me out, because I'd never done anything like this before. And certainly as an undergraduate, I had no public speaking experience or anything like that. So I didn't know what was going to happen. So that realization threw me off for a minute. And the host comes on and he says, Jesse, thanks for being on the show. And I said, good morning. And this was 5:30 Boston time, and I was like, even with the time difference, it's definitely not morning. Anyway, the host just kept going, and I sort of had to recover, and no one really said anything. And I think I did fine in the rest of the interview, but it was definitely a learning experience for me. And I tell you the story in part so you don't think that I was this sort of like natural, suave, leader, charismatic person. I went on the radio and I totally messed up. And so everything that I began to experience came out of a very sort of, in some ways, naive and inexperienced approach. But what I encountered out of my naivete was, at first, enormous disillusionment. And what do I mean by that? I mean that people who had much more power than me, who were real leaders, weren't doing anything about this. I gave you the examples already, but when it really hit home was in September of 1998, I went to a big panel at the ARCO Forum that featured 2 big professors on campus. One of them no longer teaches here. I'm not going to say his name, but he was a big activist professor on campus. And I was excited to hear him, and I went up to him, I talked to him after the lecture, I introduced myself, and I said, my name is Jesse Sage, I just graduated, I'm working on the issue of modern-day slavery, one of our campaigns is on Sudan, and I wanted to talk with you about it. And he goes, oh, I was just speaking about this with Louis Farrakhan. And I was like, oh. And he goes, I said, I know he denies that it exists. And he said, I know, but you know what? I know people who've seen it themselves, and I know it's true. So I don't doubt that there's slavery in Sudan. So I thought, this is great. This is a big professor on campus who's telling me he knows about the issue. And I said, well, it would be so helpful if you could speak out on the issue, because we're trying to get a campaign going on campus and in general nationally, and it would be great to have your voice. And he said, well, we have to be very careful how we talk about this issue. So I said, well, could you do it? And he said, call me. Here's my office. We can talk more about it. Well, I called, and needless to say, I left several messages and never heard back. And what I discovered, I'm telling a truncated version of that story, but what I discovered is that people knew. Activist people that I admired knew and had chosen not to talk about the issue. And this was like a punch in the stomach for me that sent me reeling. And for me, if you want to talk about leadership, what motivated me in the beginning was kind of despairing anger. I spent 3 months very upset. I was upset that why do I have to do this job? I didn't want to have to do this. I was planning to go on, do something else. I wasn't sure what, but this was going to be 6 months or a year. And suddenly I was faced with this lock. Here was this critical issue of modern day slavery, terrible abuse, and people knew about it and weren't talking about it. And journalists knew and weren't covering it. And human rights groups knew and weren't doing a campaign on it. And what was initially despair and anger, I began to look at as a challenge, which is, okay, what can I do to crack this lock? Because it must be crackable. And how can I use whatever limited skills I have to try and make a difference? And how can I channel my anger or my despair into activist energy? And the first thing we had to do was identify what the problem was and then try and develop some solutions. So I'll speak with you briefly about the things that I came up with. I'm not sure I had the best solutions, but I sat and I said, what can we do? The first thing I realized is that it was one thing for me or other, human rights academics or intellectuals to talk about the problem. But what we should really do is empower survivors of slavery. And so I set out to find as many survivors of slavery as I could. And there are several individuals that I've come to work with who are so inspiring. I wish I could spend the lecture just telling you their stories, because that's really what's interesting. And they actually are leaders, much more, I think, than I am. But one of the people I found as an example was Francis Bach, who was living in Iowa working in a meatpacking plant, and where he'd been resettled by the UN. So you can imagine a guy from southern Sudan. He's 6'5", a very proud Dinka, coming out of this world of average of 100+ degree heat, and he's in Ames, Iowa, working in a meatpacking plant. And I recruited him to come out and begin to speak. And there were several other survivors that we found, and we said, let's give them a platform to tell the story. Because it's one thing if I tell you in theory what the experience of slavery is like. It's another thing if you hear directly from someone who's a survivor and someone who's experienced it firsthand. And that was a huge breakthrough. We now have survivors who are the main basis of our Speakers Bureau going out and speaking on campuses all over the country. And Francis went on to testify to the Senate, meet with the president. Needless to say, I was not someone who was going to get invited to testify to the Senate. It wouldn't have been as exciting as having a survivor of slavery come. So that was a huge breakthrough. There was, I guess you could call it marketing, although I look at it as empowering the survivors to be the leaders. The second thing is I realized that we could use technology to make a difference. And I identified what I saw as two problems. The first is that slavery, as much as I could describe it to you, didn't seem immediate. It's like it was often in countries that you didn't even really know where they were on the map, and I could describe, slave raids or debt bondage or other examples, but if you couldn't see them and feel them in some way, it was much harder to motivate you. So what we did is we decided to create, and the second problem was that even if I could touch you, and even if our survivor speakers could touch you and move you to want to do something, you're busy. You have exams, you have homework, you have whatever other extracurriculars you do, and the problem of modern-day slavery is not going to be way up there on your priority list. And we had to give you a way that you could be engaged and involved simply. And so our solution was to create a website called I Abolish, which would do two things. Using multimedia, and you have to remember at the time in 1999, the net was just really beginning to pick up. We decided to make a multimedia website so slavery could be as immediate as your computer screen. One of the first things we did is we built a flash presentation of Francis telling you his story. So even if you weren't one of the several thousand people who got to hear him tell his story in person every year, anyone, anywhere in the world could log on to the internet and have a flash presentation where he told you his story. And that was an extremely powerful thing and a breakthrough in many ways. And the second thing is that we put an activist component into the website. So this may sound kind of mundane to you, but in 1999, this was a breakthrough thing. We had an activist mailing list with the new software that had just come out. And what it did is we had about 30 30,000 people, 35,000 people on our mailing list. And whenever we had a campaign, like let's say we heard about a slave raid in Sudan, and we actually sometimes got the names of individuals who were abducted into slavery, we could do a campaign demanding their release. And that campaign would target various government officials or even people in the Sudanese government sometimes. And you would get an email in your inbox. In fact, this system still works, so I should put it in the present tense. You get an email in your inbox. There's a sample letter there to the leadership that we're targeting. You can hit reply in your email, edit the letter however you want to, hit send, and our system has the capability to convert that email into a fax that would arrive in the fax machine of your congressman automatically. You don't have to enter your address. As long as you had it entered in the system before, we could hook you up. And that was just an example of where we needed to make it easy for people who were busy to still participate and still feel plugged into a movement. So that was the second breakthrough. The third thing in part of our campaigns was to identify high-profile targets. And so we actually launched our first Sudan divestment campaign targeting Talisman Energy, which is one of the biggest Canadian oil companies, in 1999. And it was a huge thing because they're traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They were a big multinational unit. They were partnering with the Sudanese government. As it turned out, their landing strips on oil fields in Sudan were being used by the Sudanese military for bombing campaigns against civilian villages. So we had them in a lock, and we were able to drive this divestment campaign in a very tangible way. We had a clear, high-profile target, and it motivated a lot of people to come on into a very tangible campaign. The other thing that we did, and which was, I have to say, a shock for me, and now become one of my mantras, is that we built a bipartisan coalition. I think, sort of coming out of the Harvard environment, I wasn't used to working across the political spectrum. Not that I was politically active on campus particularly, but I wasn't used to seeing this. And when I discovered on the issue of modern-day slavery, you can get the left and the right to actually agree and work together. And so we managed to have support from Barney Frank. For those of you who aren't familiar with Barney Frank, he's a local congressman. I think he's one of the only openly gay members of Congress, very progressive. And he's a supporter, one of the first supporters of the anti-slavery campaign and of our organization. And we also got support from Pat Robertson. So most people fall somewhere in between on the spectrum, but we realized we might not always be able to get our supporters in the same room together, but we could build a bipartisan coalition, and we could also build a coalition that was multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So we had people of all different kinds of religious backgrounds and ethnic and racial backgrounds who could agree on certain core issues. Just to give you an example, the Trafficking Act that was introduced in the Senate in 2000 was introduced by Sam Brownback, who's a pretty conservative Christian senator from Kansas, and Paul Wellstone, who was one of the most liberal members of Congress, who was the senator from Minnesota. So this is an example where people who almost never are co-sponsoring bills together could co-sponsor and work together. And I found that to be very inspiring. And in all of the work that I do, the ability to get people who otherwise disagree to work together is something that I value. And I hope, and it's also taught me to see people that initially I might not relate to, or see enemies is too strong a word, but to see people that I that's not like me, or I can't imagine that. And it's helped me broaden my horizons and see that in some ways good leadership means being able to, if you have your core values in place, work with people that you might disagree with on many other issues, but on certain key things you can work together, and the importance of doing that. And finally, the most important thing, I think, of all, was to work with young people. Because for the most part, young people aren't jaded. And I apologize to all the adults here, not so many people, but I found that the older generation was too jaded on this issue, and they'd failed. They had their opportunity to cover this issue, and they were caught up in whatever issues that they had that were mobilizing them or moving them, and it was young people who were still maybe a little bit more pure in their motives and in their outlook on the world who could be mobilized to act because they weren't jaded. And one of our outstanding activists, we were really an organization that was driven by student interns. Some of you may be old enough to remember a student who graduated a few years ago named Jay Williams, who as a freshman came out to an anti-slavery gospel festival that we had. And he was like, because Kumba was singing, and he's like, oh, I want to hear Kumba sing. It was his freshman year. He enjoyed it, and he was like, whoa, slavery in Sudan, what is this? And there was a lecture on campus 2 days later, and he came out to it. And it was some prominent Sudanese leader speaking about the problem of slavery. And he raised his hand from the back of the room. It was at the Kennedy School, and there weren't many people at the talk. But he said, hi, I'm a freshman. What can I do? And I was like, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And so we began to talk with him. He got involved as an intern with the organization. And then over the summer, actually it was in the beginning of September, he actually went to Sudan on a rescue mission and helped free people from slavery and came back to campus right as the semester was beginning. And as a result, there was massive press coverage on the Harvard campus and in the Boston Globe and on the TV news in Boston. You know, Harvard sophomore goes to Sudan, helps free slaves, and this was a way to put it on the agenda. We had many students who didn't do such high-profile things, but were enormously important in driving campaigns forward. And I found that student activism is one of the most important forces that's out there. And just to give you an example, a bunch of our student interns in the year 2000 got together and got the ARCO Forum to sponsor a seminar on modern-day slavery with a particular emphasis on Sudan. And I remember it was 2 years earlier that I'd been at the ARCO Forum and had been very disappointed by a top Harvard professor not being interested. So I thought this was an interesting closure, perhaps, on that moment. Well, the panel was a professor from Harvard, Jay Williams, the Harvard student who was at that time a sophomore, and Francis Bach, the author of Escape from Slavery, me, and someone from the White House, who was involved in issues of human trafficking. Francis describes this episode in his book. If I had more time, I would read you about what happens from his point of view. But basically, you had up there someone from the White House and an academic, and they're going on, and Jay Williams just says, this is what I saw, this is who I worked with, we've got to do something. And Francis gets up there, and without notes, he eloquently tells his story and says, I need Americans to help. And when it was my turn to speak, I was sitting there and I suddenly realized that, and I told the crowd, and we had 500 people packing the ARCO Forum for this presentation, I said, you know, the reason our government has been silent, and I noted that Bill Clinton hadn't yet ever publicly addressed the issue of slavery in Sudan, I said the reason our government has been silent is because we've been silent. So you need to speak out, and in fact today you're lucky because there's someone from the White House who's sitting right here. And if you want the White House to speak out, you can tell her. And it just sort of occurred to me in the middle of the presentation, but what happened is student after student got up at the microphone, and we had actually some high school students there as well, and they got up and they said, you know, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a student at this school, and why isn't the president talking about this issue? He must say something about it. And, you know, first one student said it, then another. And by the time it was the fourth or fifth student, the woman from the White House was clearly caught off guard and very flustered. And she said, look, I want you to know I'm going back to Washington tomorrow, and I will definitely be passing on this message to the White House. And then actually later, I think it was 2 days later, we got a call from the National Security Council, and they said, look, December 8th, I think it was, is International Human Rights Day. The president is going to be giving a talk. I think he'll be very happy with what he has to say. And indeed, Clinton got up there and he talked about many issues, but he saluted the students in America and the human rights activists who were addressing the scourge of slavery in Sudan. And he thanked them for their work, and he said we need to do more. And Francis writes in his book how proud he felt that he'd been able to help make a difference. This was the first time, it was at the end of Clinton's term, but a combination of student activists, survivors speaking out, and just general students being decent people and speaking out to the White House, we got a major breakthrough. The first time the U.S. president had ever talked about the issue of slavery in Sudan, and you remember that Francis was abducted in 1986 when Ronald Reagan was president. So this was a problem that both Republicans and Democrats had in failing to address the issue. And I think it was a huge breakthrough. So I use that for you a little bit as a bookend of my experience with leadership, where I saw a failure of leadership, and then I saw people empowered and an ability to make a breakthrough. And I think if you look now in 2006, you'll see how far we've come. There's a trafficking office, which is a part of the State Department, which has to monitor slavery all over the world, and every year produce a report. There's an office in the Justice Department focused on human trafficking in the United States. Harvard students are very active on the issue. I gave you some examples before. I'm inspired by the current undergraduates who've stepped up to become leaders. I'm thinking in particular of people like Ben Collins and Manav Bhatnagar, some of you may know, who last year suddenly heard about Harvard being invested in some companies that are doing business in Sudan, some oil companies, and they said, we should do something about this. So they started a divestment petition, and lo and behold, it really developed into a movement which despite some difficulties over the course of several months, was successful in getting Harvard to divest. And I see that more and more examples across the country of young people stepping up and being activists. And I think Sudan in particular is one of the biggest international issues on college campuses now, something unimaginable in 1998. And you have people like Francis going around speaking on all kinds of campuses across the country. You have you may have seen Simon Deng, another survivor of slavery, just did a march from the UN to the Capitol. And his story, many students joined him along the way. He was profiled in the BBC and several other places. He's another of the survivors who's speaking out. And I should tell you that on April 30th, at the end of the month, there's a big, big rally planned on Darfur, on the Capitol, and something that students from all over the country are coming out to. Again, unimaginable when I first came to this issue. So I want to offer you some lessons based on my experience as a unwitting leader, if that's the word that Tal would use to describe me. And I have to say, I'm generally not a fan of those business books you see in the airport bookstores where they're like, 10 essentials of good leadership and stuff like that. I know you guys have heard from people and some professors and others who are experts on leadership. So I don't claim to be an expert on leadership. I will give you just a few lessons from my experience, which may not apply in every case, but they certainly applied in my case. The first thing is that I think a good leader knows when to hang back. And in fact, one definition of a leader could be someone who helps other people become leaders. I've taken some of the most pleasure from empowering other people to speak out. Francis publishing his story and being a leading activist and speaker on campus is one of my, I can't say it's an accomplishment because I only had some part to play in it, but I'm so happy that there's an engaged student movement that goes on its own, and that there are survivor speakers who are out there on their own leading this. And I think a good leader enables other people to be leaders and act. Also our interns and student activists who've gone out. The second thing I would tell you about leadership, certainly in the activist field, is that it is a manic experience. I told you about my initial anger and despair and frustration, and it's not like it's gone away. Don't get me wrong. We have by no means solved the issues that at least I'm engaged in addressing. And there are many days when I come home from work very unhappy, very disappointed in myself, in the world, upset that more people aren't active. And yet there are also moments where I see this breakthrough, and it gives me such encouragement and inspiration that it's sort of like a high. And my advice to you would be to, whatever you can, try and minimize those lows when you're disappointed in a leadership position and seize upon the highs. Because if you can do that, it will help drive you forward. And you should just expect that there are going to be both of those things. I also think that you have to be sensitive with a thick skin. And what I mean by that is whenever you do activism and speak out, people are going to be offended, and people are going to disagree with you, and people are going to pick at what you're doing and tell you, you're not doing it right, you're doing it wrong, this is a mistake, why are you doing this is terrible, or whatever. And I think you need to be secure in what you're doing is right, but I also think you need to be decent and responding to the critics. And I think it's very important that you just sort of take control and relax a little bit and not get too caught up or too sensitive. And it's something I'm still working on when people attack you or criticize the work that you're doing. In the end, if you know what you're doing is right, do it decently, be a sensitive person, and try and look out for other people. I should add, it's not only in terms of critics. When you're a leader, in some ways you're telling other people what to do, or you're guiding other people. And inevitably in that process, you may hurt other people's feelings by being too brusque, or too focused on what you need to do to get done. And just, keep going, be driven, but also try and step back sometimes and be sensitive and be ready and be a little bit alert for when your positive leadership qualities will have some negative impact sometimes on other individuals. Also, that comes from that is keep learning. You're going to make mistakes, and you have to learn from them. And I can't tell you how many things I'm still learning. I didn't know what I was getting into. I'm still sometimes taken aback when things go wrong, and I'm also sometimes taken aback when things go well, and I didn't expect them to. So just to constantly stay alert and be nimble and not too stuck in your ways. I think when you're stuck in your ways, you end up like all those people who weren't speaking out on slavery or the genocide in Sudan because they were stuck in their ways. They weren't able to adjust and recognize the problem and deal with it. So it's a very important thing to do. I have another message for you which may not fully make sense when you first hear it, but I want you to know that you're more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And it may sound strange, but you guys, even compared to 1998, the resources that were at my disposal as a college student, certainly a college student at Harvard, are nothing compared to even the resources you guys have. You guys are free people in the most powerful country in the world. You have this incredible technology at your fingertips. You're sitting here. Some of you may be browsing the internet while I'm talking because of wireless capabilities. You can connect over broadband with people all over the world. Images and things that happen in a remote corner of the world can immediately be arriving on your computer screen. You can be contacting and working with activists anywhere in the world. This is unbelievable and unprecedented, the amount of leverage and power that you have. And one message I have for you is about your freedom, to encourage you to see yourselves as incredibly powerful people who've got this incredible gift, but it's a gift it's actually a burden, because you can do a lot of different things with it, and you have to figure out what's the best use of that freedom and that power that you have. And it can be used in very wonderful ways. And as part of that, I would just say that there are people living under dictatorships, people in slavery, not just under dictatorships, and also people who are not in slavery but are living under dictatorships who depend on you, because they have nothing like the freedom you have. You can criticize whoever you want, you can say what you want, you can do what you want, you can express your identities how you want to. And what I've discovered working with the people that I work with is that there are a lot of people out there who don't have even those basic rights. And they're counting on you in some ways to step up and support them, to give them a platform. In some ways, the way we gave someone like Francis Bach a platform. And I should add, at the same time, there are dictators out there, like the dictatorship that's controlled Sudan since 1989, General Omar al-Bashir. He's counting on you not to use your freedom to speak out. He's counting on you to be obsessed with other things and not pay attention to him, because his own people can't hold him responsible. I could not get up in the University of Khartoum and give the lecture that I'm giving. And we couldn't have a rally there. We would get kicked out of school, arrested, maybe worse. And here we can do whatever we want in terms of our outspokenness. And I really encourage you guys to seize that and to use that ability. And sometimes you can get trapped into being caught up in your local battles and miss the bigger picture. I think that may be what happened a little bit with journalists and with the human rights community and even with the State Department, that they had their little things that they were dealing with and their little differences, and they missed this big elephant in the room, which was slavery and a genocide. And I think the challenge for all of you is to figure out how can you work with people that you might disagree with sometimes on certain core issues of freedom and basic human rights. My last message to you is to make the most of every situation. So that's what we did at the ARCO Forum. There was a member of the White House staff sitting next to us, and we realized suddenly we could direct a message to the White House through this person here. We didn't plan on doing it, but that's what happened. And I'm going to make the most of the situation by telling you that the real reason I came here was not to tell you about leadership, but to recruit you guys, because we need you. And so I came here actually hoping that some of you, that this talk may resonate with you in some way and that you'll want to get involved to help. So I'm actually here on a recruiting mission. And I'm trying to use this moment where Tal very kindly asked me to come into his class to ask you to come and consider working with me and the people I work with on very important human rights issues, because we need your help. If some of you are looking for jobs or internships, or even not even such a serious commitment, if you want to do some activism on campus and you're ready to work with people across a wide spectrum, please come and see me afterwards. I'll be here. We have a sign-up list you can sign up for I Abolish, or you can go to the website and sign up. But I'm asking you, and I'm trying to use this moment to ask you to step up and in some small way be a leader on this issue. So thank you for listening to me, and I'll take questions if anyone has any.
It's noon, so if you have any questions, why don't you come up and speak with Jesse. Thank you again. Thank you.